This table build includes loose mortise and tenon joinery. It has splayed tapered legs, which gives it great lines and an elegant appearance. And since the client doesn't like bow ties, I'll be stabilizing this bark inclusion without disturbing this beautiful figure. I chose the edges of this board for the legs because that's where the rift grain is at. Rift grain is preferable for table legs because it will have the same appearance on all four sides. Next, I'm going to joint the rough sawn table legs using a straight line ripping jig I made for the table saw. The jig holds the legs tightly in place while it runs perfectly straight on the rip fence. This results in a perfectly straight cut, just like it was cut on the jointer. I remount the leg in the jig, rotating the freshly cut surface down against the jig bed. This helps establish that perfect 90-degree relationship between the two cut edges. Repeat this process for all four table legs. I planed the remaining two sides of all four legs on the surface planer. This board is for the aprons, but I need to resaw it in half. This board has already been through the joiner and the planer to make it straight, smooth, and square. Now that the apron blanks are flat and straight, I'll rip them to width on the table saw. The stop block is set in preparation to cut the long rails to length. The first end of the rail gets a fresh table saw cut just to make sure everything is just square and perfectly true so that the mortise and tenon joint will fit perfect. Flip the rail stock end for end, drop the stop block, and position that freshly cut edge up against it. And then make the cut. The remaining long rail and the short rails are completed the same way. I clamp the leg stock to the rip fence of the crosscut sled so that I can true all of these ends up all at once. A 3-horse table saw cuts these maple legs like butter. Flip the legs end for end, set the stop block, and cut each one for length. I'm mounting a test rail from the leftover stock so I can lay out the mortises and the rails for loose mortise and tenon joints. This bench clamp vise thing holds the workpieces square and plumb without restricting access. In order to set the depth of cut, I bottom the router bit against the bench top. Then I set the depth stop on the plunge router to 1 inch using a setup block. I'm using a 5/16 up spiral router bit, so I'm using a 5/16 inch setup block to visualize with. I'm going to do a 1/4 inch shoulder on the face of the rails. This isn't exactly centered in the rail stock, but it's close enough. I used the 1/4 inch setup block to set the router fence. I'm keeping the mortises a 1/2 inch in from the edges. Getting too close to the edges can compromise strength, and since I still have to bevel the rails for the 5-degree splay, there's no reason to flirt with disaster. I plunge the router bit into the rail about a 1/4 inch per pass, which means these 1-inch mortises will take 4 passes. As long as I run the router from left to right while cutting, the bit rotation will pull the router fence against the rail. This makes controlling the cut pretty easy, but not automatic either. I eyeball the ends where I start and stop the cuts. I stay away from the lines until the last pass, and even if I overcut a smidge, it's really no big deal. The term loose mortise and tenon doesn't mean it's a loose fitting joint, by the way. It simply means that the tenon is made separately instead of being cut into the rails like an integral tenon. I first noticed this wobbling around while plunging when editing the video. This is a mistake in technique, obviously. I'll be more mindful of it in the future. There's a little overcutting at the start of some of the mortises, but they're 95% okay. Now, that might not be good enough for NASA, but it's nothing to be concerned about in furniture as long as the fit and finish are good. All the mortises and all the rails are cut the same way. The ends of the aprons get cut at 6.5 degrees. This is 5 degrees for the splay angle, plus 1.5 degrees to accommodate the taper in the legs. I'm cutting one end of each of the rails first, and then I'll cut the second ends after carefully reorientating them. The tops and bottoms of the rails need to be beveled at 5 degrees to match the splay of the legs. I want to point out that the blade guard has been removed for videography. I'm actually pretty religious about using it whenever possible. I may as well disclaim that woodworking can be dangerous and that your safety is your responsibility and not mine. The rails get flipped face down so the already beveled edge goes against the rip fence. This ensures that the second bevel is parallel to the first bevel as needed for this project. After ripping the second bevel on the long rails, it was apparent that the bevel wasn't quite reaching the edge. So I reset the rip fence about 1/32 of an inch or 1/2 millimeter closer to the blade and made the second bevels on all the rails. Here's a quick look at the rails all milled up and ready to go. Next step is just hand planing and sanding them smooth. While hand planing the rails, noticed that it had grain coming and going both directions. That's usually a tough situation for hand planing. I gave it a shot anyway, and sure enough, I was getting a little bit of tear out in both directions, flipping it end for end and trying to hand plane it again. So these rails will need to be sanded instead of hand planed. While setting up to mortise the legs, I realized that the mortises in the rails weren't going to match the angle of the leg mortises. It seemed right to mortise the rails while the ends were square, but they needed to be mortised after cutting the splay angle, so I routed them again. I reset the fence on a straight line jig to cut the tapers on the legs and cut them on the table saw. After cutting the first side, I rotate the leg so that the tapered side we just cut is up. If it were placed down or against the fence, it might introduce a bevel as well, and that would almost certainly show up in the fit between the rails and the legs. The second side is tapered just like the first side. This jig is working really well so far, not bad for some scrap plywood I got from work out of an old shipping skid. I'm hand planing the legs to get them smooth and flat in preparation for mortising. Taking the time to do this now should mean less drama when it comes to getting a gap-free joint between the rails and legs. The grain on the legs is all straight enough to be hand planed without any tear out like I got on the rails. Laying out the mortises on one leg lets me know how deep to set the depth stop on the router. Mortises on thin legs like these will almost always intersect each other. Setting the router fence to 3/8 of an inch will create a 1/8 inch reveal between the legs and the rails. I set the depth stop on the router to 3/4 of an inch, which is the depth of the mortises in the legs. The mortises in the legs are routed like they were in the rails. I marked the ends of the mortises by transferring them from the rails. To ensure the second mortises are made in the right place, I carefully rotate each leg so the side to be mortised is up. Then I flip them end for end so the router fence registers against the straight side. The tapered sides receive the mortises, but the router fence rides on the untapered sides. This results in straight mortises instead of tapered mortises. The second mortises are milled the same manner as the first ones. Since the mortises intersect, they only require 2 passes. With the mortises complete, you can see that they do indeed intersect each other. Now we need to make the tenons, so I set the rip fence on the bandsaw to 5/16 inch strong. Babs makes easy work of this. I'm using offcuts and the first short rails that I messed up for the tenons. After the resaw, I planed them to their final thickness on the planer, checking as I went until the fit was right. The tenon stock is ripped to width on a table saw. I'm not going to do roundovers on the tenons because, well, life's just too short to spend that kind of time on something that doesn't show. The resulting joints will still be greatly stronger than needed for furniture. I stack the tenons up and square cut the first end for good measure. I cut the tenons to length on the table saw using the rip fence. This is a little unorthodox, but it works great for this. I made the small push block from the leftovers from resawing the tenon stock. I'm pre-gluing the tenons into the rails to lessen the chance for issues later on. This is optional, but I think it's best for this situation. I chose the speed set glue for its gap filling properties and not for the speed. These joints are just a little loose, so the gap filling properties of this PVA base glue will help out. Since the mortises intersect inside the legs, I'm cutting the ends of the tenons at 45 degrees so that they meet inside the legs, and each joint has the same amount of glue surface area so they all have equal strength. A quick test fit to make sure everything fits right before glue up. I tested the clamping setup as well, and I thought I was going to need shims due to the splay, but I didn't. These clamps work just fine. Alright, it's finally time for some real glue up. You might have noticed that I haven't cut the ends on the legs yet. I'm going to do that on the table saw later. Right now, I'm gluing up the legs and short rails as 2 assemblies. I'm not going for everything all at once. I like to apply glue with a brush. This is just a simple fan brush like Bob Ross used to use to paint pine trees with. Its thin shape gets into the mortises nicely, and it's wide enough too to apply glue pretty quickly. I apply glue to all mating surfaces in the glue joint. This just ensures glue gets everywhere and ensures the strongest joint. This popular method of just squirting some glue in the mortise and banging the tenon home was tested by some woodworking magazine like years and years ago, and it was found to create glue-starved joints fairly often. The only guaranteed way to get glue everywhere it belongs is to put it there on purpose. This also has the benefit of greatly reducing, if not eliminating, squeeze out altogether. While the glue dries on the leg assemblies, let's get to work on the top. I planed both faces flat and smooth, and I jointed one edge on the joiner. Now I'm ripping the opposite edge square and parallel to the jointed edge. I decided to lose the live edge area. It had some pretty bad checking, and I decided I wanted both ends square. I just thought that having only one live edge would have looked kind of odd. The blade is set to the splay angle plus leg taper for a total of about 6.5 degrees. I carefully guide the leg assembly on the rip fence while supporting the leg near the blade. I practiced this a few times before making the cut. With the bottoms of the legs cut correctly, I inadvertently decided to cut the tops in the wrong direction. The method worked great, but all the light and camera setup, I got the woodworking wrong. Hey, you gotta let me blame it on something, right? Once I discovered my mistake, I flipped them over and cut them in the right direction. I lost a little height from the table, but it's not going to be noticeable. I'm glad I left a little extra meat at the top of the mortises because I pretty much used it up here. Before we can finish gluing up the base, we need to make sure everything is fitting well. I had to shorten 2 tenons on the long rails to get a gap-free fit, and one more dry fit with clamp up just to be sure it's ready for glue. Gluing up the base went smoothly. Once it was glued and clamped, I stood it up on the table saw to make sure it was sitting flat, made one little nudge, and it sat nice and flat, and I let the glue set up that way. Once the glue dried for an hour or so, I trimmed the tops of the long rails on the table saw. I had to adjust the rip fence just a little bit since I didn't want to cut into the top of any of the legs and create a gap. Before I resaw the top for thickness, I want to stabilize the bark inclusion just in case. The top seems good and strong, but since I have to stabilize it anyway, it seems best to do it now. I flood thin CA into the inclusion and just let it drink. I wipe off excess so it doesn't create ridges that require sanding. Once it sets for a few minutes, I flip it over and repeat. I let the CA cure naturally since I cannot tolerate the activator. It's the only chemical I've encountered that I'm sensitive to. It just tears my sinuses up. One of the keys to success on a 12-inch wide resaw like this is to get the edge perfectly square so the face on the rip fence and the edge on the table sit naturally. A 4.5 horsepower bandsaw doesn't hurt either, and if this kind of looks like a piece of cake, because it actually was. After the resaw, I smoothed out the saw cut with a few passes on the surface planer. I did some more CA stabilizing for good measure. I have to fill this up for finish anyway, so I may as well be sure to get thin CA in everywhere. I sanded off a few ridges and nubs in preparation to bevel the edges on the underside of the top, so that it sits against the panel raising jig without any issues. I marked the top at 1 3/8 inches to establish the taper. The table saw blade is tilted to 20 degrees. I start a little too wide on purpose and sneak up on the final rip fence setting. Once I have it, I run all 4 sides. This panel raising jig rides on the rip fence and makes this operation relatively easy. It also works amazingly on bridle joints. I left the tops of the rails a little proud of the tops of the legs, and I'm using a hand plane here to level them off. My technique might look a little odd, but there's a method to it. The rails are a little more proud on the ends nearest me, so I need to remove more material there. I finish up with complete passes. I prefer a very light shaving while doing this since it makes controlling the cut more manageable. This is good enough for now. I'll see if this needs any more work when I attach the top. I use a hand plane set for a very light shaving to remove pencil marks and any rough spots I can reach with it. Then I switch to a card scraper for the stuff that a hand plane won't reach, like the rails. A light touch is all that's needed to remove planer and table saw marks. A card scraper is a huge time saver for this. Finally, I use 220 grit sandpaper to smooth everything out and to break the sharp edges so that they'll accept finish and feel nice to the touch. I'm dyeing the base black since the grain on this maple doesn't really excite me. I work around the base a few times without stopping since the alcohol dries so quickly. I sand the bottom of the top while I let the base dry for a little while. I doubt it really needs the time, I just feel like it's best practice. I sand the bevel to smooth out the saw cuts. Next, I sand all the CA I used in the bark inclusion. I filled this several times with medium CA to get it right. Next time, I think I'll use epoxy. The CA was just kind of a pain. I'm hand sanding the base with 800 grit because I don't want to sand through the die and all the way back into the base wood. The 800 raised the grain a little without breaking through, which is exactly what I wanted. I'm applying dye for the second time using a more diluted mix this time. I'm just kind of evening things out and hitting some spots that look a little thin. It's time for the CA finish. I flood it on and spread it as fast as I possibly can because CA starts curing in seconds when it's spread thin like this. The moisture in the wood and in the air make it set really quick. I'm trying to keep it from forming puddles since they would require a lot of sanding. Plus, I try to give the thirsty areas a little more. It's already gelling up after about 55 seconds. After this, I let it cure naturally. I sand the top with 220 in preparation for paste wax. Wax is applied with a paper towel. I let it dry and buff it out with a clean paper towel. The wax is primarily to get the luster I like and not really for protection. The CA is 99% of the protection. Dark brown brie wax is applied for the base for additional subtle color and protection. It drank a fair amount of this up, so I gave it a generous amount and then buffed it off with a clean paper towel. I drilled pocket holes in the base to attach the top. Pocket holes are fine for a small table like this since the top isn't wide enough for movement to be a big consideration. The slop in the holes of the pocket screws is enough for this application. I center the base on the top and drive the screws home with a cordless drill. The finished table should look nice in any decor, and most of all, my wife is happy with it, and that's the most important client of all. Watch the video queued up on your screen now for more woodworking.